out. Nothing can destroy it.
The rocket crashed. The astronaut returned. But something else came back with him. The Quatermass Experiment wasn't just Britain's first serious science fiction film. It was a gamble that nearly bankrupted a studio, a production plagued by technical disasters, and a movie so terrifying it traumatized children across the nation. The BBC created it for television first, but when Hammer Films decided to adapt it, they didn't play safe. They went darker, stranger, and more visceral than anyone thought possible in 1955. The lead actor collapsed on set, the monster effects were destroyed mid-shoot, and the film's success, it accidentally invented an entire genre. These are 20 weird facts about the Quatermass Experiment. And buried in the chaos, a title change so crucial, it transformed Hammer from a struggling B-movie factory into a horror empire. Strap in. This experiment gets dangerous fast. Before there was Alien, before there was The Thing, there was Professor Bernard Quatermass, but he wasn't created for cinema. He was born on live television in 1953 when BBC writer Nigel Kneale needed something to fill a 6-week Saturday night slot. Science fiction on TV was almost non-existent in Britain. Nobody thought it would work. Kneale wrote the serial anyway, creating a rocket scientist investigating the first manned space mission gone wrong. What came back wasn't human anymore. The BBC serial terrified the nation. Streets emptied during broadcasts. Parents complained that children couldn't sleep. Churches protested the implications of alien contamination. And Hammer Films, a small British studio churning out low-budget thrillers, saw dollar signs. They'd never made science fiction before. They'd never adapted a TV property. They barely had the money to try. But producer Anthony Hines knew one thing: terror sold tickets. So Hammer bought the rights, hired director Val Guest, and prepared to bring Quatermass to the big screen. What they didn't realize was that this one film would define everything Hammer would become for the next 2 decades. A studio built on intelligent horror, gothic atmosphere, and stories that didn't talk down to audiences. It all started here. The title wasn't just change for style, it was change for survival. In Britain, the film was called The Quatermass Xperiment, a deliberate misspelling that screamed danger and scientific horror. But American distributors didn't care about Professor Quatermass. They'd never heard of him. The BBC serial hadn't aired in the States, so when the film crossed the Atlantic, it got a new name: The Creeping Unknown. Blunt, sensational, perfectly designed for drive-in marquees and double bills. Hammer hated it. Kneale hated it. But the American market was too valuable to fight. The retitling worked. In the US, the film became a cult hit under its exploitation banner. Meanwhile, in Britain, that X in Experiment did something brilliant. It echoed the X certificate, Britain's adults-only rating for horror and shocking content. Audiences knew immediately this wasn't a children's film. It was certified dangerous. And that X became Hammer's calling card. Years later, they'd use it again and again, turning the X certificate into a brand. The Curse of Frankenstein, Dracula, X the Unknown, all of them leaning into that single letter like a badge of honor. One title change accidentally created a marketing revolution. Brian Donlevy was supposed to be the hero. Instead, he became the problem. The American actor was cast as Professor Quatermass to help secure US distribution. He had star power, a tough guy presence from years of Hollywood noir and war films. But from day one, he clashed with everyone. Donlevy didn't understand the character. On the BBC serial, Quatermass was intellectual, morally complex, driven by science and guilt. Donlevy played him like a hard-boiled detective, barking orders, punching his way through scenes. Director Val Guest tried to guide him towards subtlety. Donlevy ignored him. Nigel Kneale, watching from the sidelines, was horrified. He later said Donlevy turned Quatermass into a thuggish American stereotype, exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. But here's the strange part. It worked, not artistically, but commercially. British audiences found Donlevy's gruff intensity compelling in its own way. American audiences loved seeing a no-nonsense hero who didn't waste time philosophizing. The performance was wrong for the character, but right for the box office. And in 1955, that was enough. Hammer needed a hit. They got one, even if it meant sacrificing Kneale's original vision in the process. Sometimes the wrong choice makes all the money. The monster wasn't a man in a suit. It was something far stranger and far more unstable. In the film's climax, astronaut Victor Carun has been completely transformed by an alien organism, becoming a grotesque mass of mutating flesh and tentacles. The effects team built the creature using foam, latex, wire armatures, and organic materials that looked disturbingly real under the lights, realistic enough to horrify test audiences, realistic enough to make actors recoil during filming. But there was a problem. The materials were experimental. The foam latex wasn't stable. The organic textures started decomposing under the heat of the studio lamps. By the second day of shooting the final creature scenes, the monster was literally rotting. The smell became unbearable. Chunks of latex sagged and peeled away. The effects crew worked overnight, trying to rebuild sections, patch the deterioration, keep it looking consistent from shot to shot. They couldn't. If you watch closely, the creature changes appearance between cuts in the Westminster Abbey sequence, not because of continuity errors, but because it was falling apart in real time. Val Guest had to shoot fast, grabbing every usable take before the whole thing collapsed into a pile of decomposing rubber and wire. What made it to screen was a monster that genuinely looked like it was dying, disintegrating, wrong, and somehow that made it more terrifying than any polished effect could have been.
Look! Nothing can destroy it.
Westminster Abbey wasn't supposed to be in the film. The original script ended in a television studio, a confined space where Quatermass could confront the creature and talk it down. Small, contained, budget-friendly. But Val Guest hated it. He wanted scale, grandeur, something that would make this feel like more than a B-movie. So he rewrote the climax to take place in Westminster Abbey, one of the most iconic locations in Britain. The problem? They couldn't actually film there. Westminster Abbey doesn't allow fictional filming, especially not horror, so the production built a replica on the Hammer soundstage. Not the whole Abbey, just enough to suggest it. Arches, scaffolding, stone textures. The art department worked with a tiny budget using forced perspective and careful lighting to make a small set feel cathedral-sized. It's a trick, but it's a brilliant one. The scaffolding around the Abbey was real, left over from actual restoration work happening at the time. Guest incorporated it into the story, making the climax feel contemporary and urgent, and that final confrontation, with Quatermass appealing to the last shred of humanity inside the monster, while electricity crackles through the scaffolding, became one of the most powerful endings in 1950s science fiction, all because the director refused to settle for a TV studio. Jack Warner was the first choice for Quatermass, not the American studio mogul. The British actor, beloved for playing kindly, authoritative figures in films and later television, Warner had the perfect presence. Intellectual, warm, trustworthy. He read the script, loved the character, and agreed to do it. Then he pulled out at the last minute. The reason? Fear. Not of the role, but of being typecast in science fiction, a genre still considered lowbrow in British cinema circles. Warner's career was built on respectability, on war heroes, and dependable professionals. Playing a scientist battling alien contamination felt too risky, too strange, too likely to damage his carefully curated image. So, he walked away, leaving Hammer scrambling. That's when Brian Donlevy entered the picture, bringing his Hollywood credentials and completely different energy. But here's the twist. Years later, Jack Warner admitted he regretted the decision. The Quatermass Experiment became a landmark film, and he'd turned down the chance to be part of it. Meanwhile, Brian Donlevy's version of Quatermass, flawed as it was, became iconic enough that he reprised the role in the sequel, Quatermass 2. Sometimes the role you reject becomes the one that haunts you. Warner spent the rest of his career playing it safe, while Hammer rewrote the rules of British cinema without him. The transformation scenes pushed boundaries that had never been tested before. When Victor Carun begins mutating, his skin splitting, his humanity peeling away, the makeup effects were designed to be genuinely disturbing. Actor Richard Wordsworth spent hours in the makeup chair, as prosthetics were layered onto his face and hands, creating textures that looked diseased, alien, wrong. The British Board of Film Censors watched the rough cut and panicked. They'd never seen body horror like this in a British film. There was no precedent, no rulebook for how to rate something that made infection and mutation look so visceral. They debated cutting the transformation entirely. Val Guest fought back. He argued the horror was essential to the story, that sanitizing it would gut the film's impact. After tense negotiations, they reached a compromise. The transformation stayed, but certain close-ups were trimmed, certain angles softened. The film received an X certificate, restricting it to adults only, and that restriction became the film's greatest marketing tool. The X didn't hurt ticket sales, it exploded them. Parents forbade their children from seeing it, which made teenagers desperate to sneak in. The censorship controversy generated headlines, free publicity that Hammer couldn't have bought. What the censors meant as a warning became a promise. This film would show you something you'd never seen before. And it delivered.
Because this man knows that thing.
Richard Wordsworth gave the performance of his career, and it nearly destroyed him. Playing Victor Carroon required him to convey the gradual loss of humanity through physical transformation alone. As the alien organism takes over, Carroon loses the ability to speak, to recognize loved ones, to remember who he was. Wordsworth studied patients suffering from neurological diseases, watched footage of people in the late stages of illness losing motor control. He wanted the deterioration to feel medically real, not theatrical. On set, he spent entire days hunched, twisted, moving with the stiff, jerking gait of someone whose body no longer obeyed them. The physical toll was immense. His back seized up, his muscles ached from holding unnatural positions for take after take. But the emotional toll was worse. Wordsworth had to access a place of complete isolation, playing a man trapped inside his own disintegrating body, aware of what's happening, but powerless to stop it. Between takes, crew members said he'd sit alone, still partially in character, struggling to shake off the darkness. The performance was so unsettling that it became difficult to watch. Audiences felt genuine pity for Carroon, even as they recoiled from what he'd become. Wordsworth never became a major star, but for that one film, he created something unforgettable, a monster you mourned.
Strain and tension you've been under, but to stop now when we're...
The rocket crash that opens the film used real newsreel footage, and nobody asked permission. In 1955, space exploration was still theoretical, experimental, and mostly classified. But various countries had been testing rockets, and when those tests failed, the spectacular crashes were sometimes filmed. Hammer's production team scoured newsreel archives looking for footage of rocket disasters. They found it. Explosions, debris fields, twisted metal. They cut it into the opening sequence without crediting the sources or securing formal rights. It was a gray area. The footage was real, the disasters were real, and using it gave the film an authenticity that miniature effects couldn't match. Audiences in 1955 didn't know they were watching actual failed rocket launches. They just knew it looked terrifyingly real. Later, some of the newsreel companies noticed and complained, but by then the film was already in wide release. Hammer quietly settled, paying token fees to avoid lawsuits. The gamble worked. That opening sequence, grounded in real imagery, set a tone of plausibility that carried through the entire film. Science fiction didn't have to look fake. It could look like tomorrow's news, and that made it far more frightening than any fantasy ever could. The film's success changed Hammer forever, but nobody saw it coming. The Quatermass Experiment was made on a shoestring budget, shot quickly, released with modest expectations. Hammer was still a small operation, grinding out B-movies and crime thrillers, barely surviving. But when Quatermass hit theaters, something shifted. Critics who usually dismissed Hammer's output took notice. The film was smart, atmospheric, genuinely frightening. It proved British studios could do science fiction and horror with intelligence and style. Box office returns exceeded all projections. Lines formed around city blocks. The film played for months in some theaters, unheard of for a low-budget genre picture. And inside Hammer, the executives realized they'd stumbled onto something valuable. Horror worked. Intelligent horror worked even better. Within 2 years, they'd greenlit The Curse of Frankenstein, bringing Terence Fisher on board to direct and giving the production a bigger budget and color film stock. That became an even bigger hit, launching the Hammer Gothic horror cycle that would dominate the next decade. Dracula followed, The Mummy, dozens more, all of it traced back to Quatermass, the film that proved Hammer could compete with Hollywood on atmosphere and ideas while spending a fraction of the money. One scientist, one rocket, one contaminated astronaut. That's all it took to launch an empire. Marja Dean, playing Judith Caroon, the astronaut's desperate wife, had one strict rule on set. She refused to touch Richard Wordsworth once his transformation makeup was applied. It wasn't personal. It was pure visceral fear. The prosthetics looked so diseased, so organically wrong, that Dean couldn't shake the feeling they might be contagious. Between takes, when Wordsworth would approach to rehearse blocking or discuss a scene, she'd instinctively step back. Val Guest initially thought she was being difficult, a prima donna uncomfortable with genre material. But when he saw her genuine distress, he adjusted. He blocked scenes to minimize physical contact, used camera angles to suggest touch without requiring it, let Dean maintain distance while still selling the emotional connection. And strangely, it worked. The space between them on screen became tragic. A wife reaching toward her husband but unable to close the gap, repelled by what he'd become. Dean's real fear translated into a performance of heartbreaking rejection. In the film's most devastating moment, Judith tries to embrace Victor but can't bring herself to complete the gesture. That hesitation, that horror, it was completely real. Sometimes the best performances come from actors who aren't acting at all.
You've destroyed him like you've destroyed everything else
The film premiered simultaneously in London and New York, a coordinated release almost unheard of for a British B-movie in 1955. Hammer wanted to prove they could compete with American studios on a global stage, but the two versions audiences saw were different. The British cut ran longer, keeping character moments and dialogue scenes that built atmosphere. The American cut, released as The Creeping Unknown, was faster, tighter, trimmed of anything that slowed the horror. Entire conversations were removed, subplots were condensed. The creature appeared earlier. American distributors didn't trust audiences to sit through scientific exposition. They wanted the monster, and they wanted it now. Hammer protested but had no leverage. The US market demanded a certain pace, and they needed American dollars to justify future productions. So, two versions existed. British audiences got a cerebral science fiction thriller. American audiences got a creature feature. Both versions succeeded, but they succeeded for different reasons. Critics in Britain praised the intelligence and restraint. Critics in America called it a thrilling shocker. Same film, different countries, completely different receptions. And Hammer learned a valuable lesson. You could make one movie and sell it two ways. Just give each market what it wanted to see. The BBC hated the film. Nigel Kneale was frustrated. And yet the film's success forced the BBC to make more Quatermass. When Hammer's adaptation became a phenomenon, suddenly the professor was valuable intellectual property. The BBC, which had treated the original serial as disposable Saturday night filler, rushed Quatermass 2 into production. Kneale wrote it. They broadcast it. And Hammer immediately bought the rights for another film adaptation. It became a strange cycle. The BBC would create Quatermass content for prestige, and Hammer would adapt it for profit, each feeding off the other's success while maintaining a tense relationship. Kneale resented the films for simplifying his complex stories, for adding violence and spectacle where he'd wanted ideas and atmosphere. But he couldn't deny the films made Quatermass immortal. Without Hammer, the character would have disappeared after one BBC serial, forgotten like countless other 1950s television experiments. Instead, Quatermass became a British icon, spawning sequels, remakes, and influencing generations of science fiction writers. All because a small horror studio saw potential where the BBC saw throwaway programming. Sometimes the people who love your work least understand its value best. Val Guest shot the film in 18 days. Not because he wanted to, but because that's all the budget allowed. 18 days to capture a story spanning the launch of Britain's first space mission, the contamination of an astronaut, his transformation, and a climactic showdown in Westminster Abbey. Most films of the era took months. Guest had 2.5 weeks. The schedule was brutal, 12-hour days minimum, sometimes running to 16. Actors barely had time to learn lines before cameras rolled. The crew moved through setups at a breakneck pace, lighting scenes while actors were still rehearsing. Mistakes were kept if they didn't destroy the shot. Guest developed a shooting philosophy that would define his career. Plan everything in advance, then shoot with absolute confidence. No second guessing, no endless takes. Get it right the first time and move on. That discipline, born from financial desperation, gave the film an urgency that elevated the material. Nothing feels labored or overthought. Everything moves with purpose. The 18-day schedule should have killed the film's quality. Instead, it gave the film an energy that more expensive, carefully planned productions couldn't match. Sometimes limitations aren't obstacles, they're creative fuel. There's a moment midway through the film where Karun, barely human, stumbles into a cinema. On screen behind him, a film is playing. If you look closely, it's a Hammer production, a previous release being used as set dressing. But here's what's strange. The footage shows a scene of violence, a murder, something dark, and Karun watches it, his deteriorating mind unable to process what he's seeing, but drawn to the imagery anyway. It's a brief shot, maybe 5 seconds, but it became a point of obsession for film scholars. Was it intentional? Was Hammer commenting on their own violent output, suggesting a connection between media violence and Karun's transformation into a monster? Or was it just convenient stock footage, a quick way to dress the cinema set without paying for additional materials? Val Guest never clarified. Neither did Neil. So the moment sits there, ambiguous, open to interpretation. A mirror within a mirror. Violence watching violence. In a film about contamination and transformation, even the backgrounds carry suggestions of deeper meaning. Whether that meaning was planned or accidental, nobody knows. But it's there, waiting to be noticed. The film's tagline in America was pure exploitation genius. It creeps, it crawls, it kills. 7 words that promised everything a 1950s horror audience wanted. No mention of science, no reference to space exploration, just pure visceral threat. British marketing was more restrained, focusing on the X certificate and the BBC pedigree. The shock of the year, they called it. 2 different campaigns, 2 different promises. But both worked. The American drive-in circuit embraced the creeping unknown as perfect midnight movie material. Double billed with other creature features, marketed to teenagers looking for thrills and dates, looking for an excuse to scream and clutch each other. The British campaign targeted adults, positioning it as intelligent horror for sophisticated audiences. Is same film, wildly different positioning. And here's the fascinating part. Both audiences left satisfied. The exploitation crowd got their creature and their kills. The prestige crowd got their atmosphere and their ideas. Hammer had somehow made a film that worked on multiple levels, satisfying completely different expectations without compromising either. That versatility became their signature. Gothic horror for the art house and the grindhouse simultaneously. One film, infinite interpretations. The film's composer, James Bernard, was 25 years old and had never scored a feature before. Hammer hired him because he was cheap and available. He had studied music formally, but had no film experience. Val Guest gave him one direction: make it sound dangerous. Bernard watched the rough cut alone in a screening room and immediately knew traditional horror scoring wouldn't work. This wasn't a ghost story or a gothic romance. It was science fiction, contamination, the terror of the unknown. So he wrote something different: harsh, dissonant, modern. Staccato strings suggesting heartbeats going wrong. Brass that sounded like alarms, like warnings. Percussion that felt mechanical, inhuman. When he played it for Guest and the producers, they were shocked. It sounded nothing like film music. It sounded like panic, like machinery failing, like the future going wrong. They almost rejected it. Then they screened the film with Bernard's score attached, and everything changed. The music didn't just support the film, it amplified it, turning tension into terror. Bernard's inexperience became his strength. He hadn't learned the rules yet, so he couldn't be constrained by them. Hammer kept him on for nearly every subsequent horror production. The Curse of Frankenstein, Dracula, The Mummy, all of them carried Bernard's signature sound. A career that began with one dangerous experiment. During test screenings, 3 audience members fainted during the Westminster Abbey climax. One required medical attention. The The sequence with its crackling electricity, the creature's final transformation, and Quatermass's desperate plea to the last fragment of humanity inside the monster proved too intense for some viewers. Hammer's producers were thrilled. They leaked the fainting incidents to the press, turning a potential liability into marketing gold. The film's so shocking, audiences collapsed. Newspapers ran the story. Radio programs discussed whether horror films had gone too far. Doctors weighed in on the psychological effects of cinematic terror. Civic groups called for stricter censorship, and ticket sales soared, because nothing sells horror better than proof it actually horrifies. The fainting audience members became part of the film's legend, evidence that what you were about to see could overwhelm you. Whether all 3 faintings were genuine, or if 1 or 2 were planted by savvy publicists, nobody knows. But the effect was undeniable. The film gained a reputation as dangerously powerful, something that could break through the safety of fiction and affect you physically. That reputation outlasted the film's theatrical run, becoming part of horror cinema lore. The film never won major awards. It wasn't nominated for BAFTAs. The Academy ignored it completely. Critics respected it, but didn't champion it as art. And yet, the Quatermass Experiment changed British cinema more than most award winners ever did. It proved British studios could make genre films that competed globally. It demonstrated that horror could be intelligent without being pretentious. It showed that low budgets didn't mean low quality if talent and vision were present. Within 5 years of its release, British horror became an industry. Not just Hammer, but Amicus, Tygon, smaller studios all following the template Quatermass has established. The British film industry, which had largely ignored genre material, suddenly embraced it as commercially viable. Actors who'd spent careers in drawing room dramas started appearing in gothic chillers. Directors known for kitchen sink realism tried their hand at supernatural terror. All because one film about a contaminated astronaut proved there was money, prestige, and artistic satisfaction in making audiences scream. The award it won wasn't a statue, it was an entire movement. Sometimes influence matters more than recognition. The legacy speaks louder than the trophy case ever could. 50 years after its release, the British Film Institute restored the Quatermass Experiment, frame by frame, sound by sound. They tracked down the original negative, badly degraded from decades of storage and multiple prints being struck. The restoration took 2 years, cost hundreds of thousands of pounds, and resulted in a version of the film that looked better than it had even in 1955. The restored print premiered at the National Film Theatre with Val Guest in attendance. Elderly now, but still sharp. He watched his 18-day miracle projected for a new audience, and afterwards said something remarkable. "I thought we were just making a quick picture to keep the lights on. I didn't know we were making history." That humility, that workmanlike approach to filmmaking defined the Hammer era. They weren't trying to make art. They were trying to make livings. But somewhere in the practical demands of budgets and schedules and keeping studios operational, they made films that endured. The restoration wasn't just preservation, it was validation. Official recognition that this cheap, rushed, almost forgotten experiment mattered. That it deserved to be seen as it was meant to be seen. 50 years, and it still had the power to terrify, to move, to remind audiences that the future, space, the unknown, they're all still dangerous. The most famous prop from the film, the rocket cabin interior where the astronauts launched, wasn't built for the Quatermass Experiment at all. It was recycled, stolen from a previous Hammer production, a forgotten low-budget war film that had used it as a submarine interior, cramped, claustrophobic, designed to suggest men trapped underwater. The art department looked at it and saw potential. They stripped out the naval equipment, repainted the walls from navy gray to sterile white, added blinking lights, scientific-looking instruments, dials that didn't actually do anything. A few wires here and some switches there. Suddenly it wasn't a submarine, it was a spaceship. The future. Nobody noticed, not the critics who praised the production design as convincing and innovative. Not the audiences who accepted it as authentic, cutting edge, exactly what a 1955 rocket interior should look like. Not the science magazines that just published photographs of it as reference material for what space travel might actually become. The prop, built for one purpose and repurposed for another, became iconic. Other films referenced it. Other studios copied it. Television productions borrowed the design. And years later, when Hammer made Quatermass 2, they brought the same prop back from storage, upgraded it slightly, added a few more blinking lights, kept the core design intact. One piece of painted wood and cheap electronics doing triple duty across multiple films, multiple genres, multiple decades. That kind of resourcefulness, that ability to make do with what you had, and make it look intentional, revolutionary even, that was Hammer's secret weapon. They didn't have Hollywood money. They didn't have studio backing or unlimited resources. But they had imagination. They had craftsmen who could transform a submarine into a spaceship with paint and lights. And sometimes, in the right hands, imagination builds better spaceships than any budget ever could. One prop, 3 lives, infinite influence.